Also want to keep Benjamin Wallace, who's recovering from pneumonia. This is the father of Rhonda Kleinard, and more information will be given on the Barnabas list as to his address and this, that, and the other later this afternoon. So let's keep these individuals, Piper Paxton, Mary Cecil, and Mr. Benjamin, in our prayers as we go before our Father before we enter into our period of study. Dear Lord, we're grateful for the day that you have given us. We're grateful that you have allowed for us to have safe travels here and to be able to be welcomed into a warm building and have an opportunity to get together and to meditate upon your word and to focus upon it. Help us to always be able to clear our hearts and our minds of the things of this world and to focus solely upon what you would have for us to see within your will this morning. As we enter into this period of study, we know that we are blessed to have good health to be able to be here, but we're mindful of those at this time who especially may not be able to physically be here because of health issues. We want to strengthen and encourage them in any way that we can, and we want to offer up whatever avenue we can to bring them healing, whether that be through our physical work or simply just by bringing them before your throne. Dear Lord, we're grateful that you have given us this recording of the Acts of the Apostles. Help us that as we navigate through it, that we learn from their courage, that we see their strength and their reliance upon you, and that we can take that and use it as motivation for our own work and our own ministry. We're especially mindful at this time of Mr. Benjamin Wallace, Miss Mary Cecil, and of Piper and Paxton, each of which are going through their own various illnesses. We want to keep it in our prayers, Mr. Benjamin, as he continues to struggle or recover from his pneumonia. We want to keep little Piper and Paxton in our prayers as they recover from the flu. Give them strength and comfort and help Miss Dolores to be able to take care of them in any way and help us to be able to lend a hand along the way. We're grateful at times, especially for the opportunities that we have to see those who are struggling to at least come to somewhat of a better health, and we're especially thankful at this time of Miss Mary Cecil and her ability to be able to return home from the nursing home. Dear Lord, we're grateful that you have sent your Son to die upon the cross for our sins, and it's through his name that we do pray. Amen. All right, we will pick up here in Acts chapter 24 in verse 10. Acts 24 and verse 10. When we were walking in this morning, kind of getting settled, Brother Irby stepped in, and I went to hand him my microphone, and I think he's getting a little confused. It's the second Sunday, not the fourth, but he said he's just here for fun. And then he gave me a little bit of pressure because he said, I thought about it. I have never heard you preach. And so I said, well, that's good. Puts a little pressure on me this morning for Brother Irby to be here. So I told him I'm going to have to go over my notes a couple more extra times just because the pressure's on this morning. But no, we're grateful to have Miss Ginger and Brother Bill. Yeah, well, that's good. I appreciate it. And I've been told that he can send me tough questions. So we got to be on our best behavior today so you don't do that. So let's look at verse 10 of Acts chapter 24. We pick up where we kind of left off with the story of Paul and his appealing or his appearance before Felix is where we kind of left off. And part of that has to do with this going up the chain of command, if you will. Because of his Roman citizenship, he is given this opportunity to appear before Felix. And because of the severity, at least, of this issue in and amongst the Jewish people, the commander saw it fit to have Paul to appear before Felix and to receive his ruling on the matter. So notice what happens beginning in verse 10. Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, "Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city. Nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense towards God and men. Now after many years I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. They ought to have been there before you to object if they had anything against me. Or else let those who are here themselves say if they have found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council. Unless it is for this one statement which I cried out standing among them concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. Notice, as part of Paul's defense of his own actions, notice some of the things that he begins to reference. If you remember what happened in the previous 9 verses of verse 24, you got the prosecution speaking, in a sense. You've got the council, or at least you've got the high priest and the council, and they bring in this man named Tertullus, who we are told is an orator. And this Tertullus begins by speaking these wonderful things and building up Felix, and then follows it by talking about how evil and wicked or horrible the things that Paul had done. And immediately following that, now is Paul's opportunity. He's already been accused of causing dissension, of bringing forth, in fact, he's called a plague in verse 5 of chapter 24. And then they said he's a ringleader of a certain sect of the Nazarenes who profanes the temple, and that's why they seized him. And so they bring forth all these accusations, and of course we see in verse 8 and 9 that those religious leaders, including Ananias and the rest of the council, seem to agree with this statement that Tertullus had made. And so what does Paul do? Well, he begins to pick apart some of these things. As any good lawyer would do, honestly. They begin to look at the accusations that are made and slowly pull away from that, almost like you're pulling Jenga blocks out of a Jenga tower. So notice what he says as he is given the opportunity to speak or to testify before Felix. He says at the beginning of midway through verse 10, "Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship." So what Paul is basically saying in verses 10 and 11 is, see for yourself. You've been a judge. You've got the experience. See for yourself of these things. Here's my account. Been in Jerusalem for 12 days. I went up to Jerusalem to worship. They found me in the temple, not disputing with anyone, nor inciting a crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city. Nor can they prove these things of which they now accuse me. So this accusation of him being a plague, a bringer of dissension, one who causes turmoil and distress within the synagogue, within the temple, within Jerusalem, he's saying, I was there for 12 days worshiping, going through this purification process. And throughout this process, none of them could prove any of these things as to what they're accusing me of, this dissension, this being a plague, this, that, and the other. So he says in verse 14, "But this I confess to you, that according to the way," of course we made mention previously, focus every time that it says the way, of course that use of the capitalization in the word way there, "which they call a sect. So I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets." Is that a true statement by Paul, that he worships the God of the fathers, believing all things that are written in the law and the prophets? Well, absolutely. As a follower of the way, that's exactly what he does. He looks to those writings of the law and the prophets, because what do those things point to? The way. They are pointing towards this Messiah. And so for him to be a follower of both the law and the writings of the prophets, or at least believing all things that are written in the law and the prophets, helps to further his case as being a follower of this way. And so in verse 15, what does he say? He says, "I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept." So if you're accusing me of something, then you need to be accusing them as well, which coincidentally is a very similar case to what he had done when he appeared before that very same council. You know, he was talking about the resurrection, the division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And as part of that, he brought up the resurrection. Why? Well, because it was something that they themselves believed, or at least the Pharisees had believed. And so he's saying, if I'm on trial for my belief within the resurrection, then they, the Pharisees, also need to be on trial as well. So he says, "I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and of the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense towards God and men." Once again, something that Paul can say with a great deal of confidence that he lives his life in a way that he has a clear conscience. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation. Why was he referencing it as his nation? Well, because of his reference back to his Jewishness, his being brought up there, or at least studying deeply within that region. In the midst of which, verse 18, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. They ought to have been there before you to object if they had anything against me, or else let those who were here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council. So what Paul has done already, before we even get to that last verse there, what Paul has done already is he has talked about his being a plague, his sowing of dissension, his causing riots or mobs to form, all these things that maybe would have been of more importance to the Roman Empire than to the Jewish Empire because of that causing of strife or issues. He's already looking at these things and saying, they found me in the temple, went through the purification process. I was offering up alms. I was offering up sacrifices. I was not with some mob. I was not causing some tumult. I was not causing some issue or dissension. And they themselves should be able to attest of this. In fact, in verse 19, it says, they ought to have been there before you to object if they had anything against me. Or else, I love what he says in verse 20, or else let those who were here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council. I have already appeared before this very same group within their own courts. And so ask them what their resolution or what their accusation, I guess, would be against him. Not their accusation, their ruling, their judgment would have been me of their own counsel. And so he responds in verse 21, unless it is for this one statement which I cried out, standing among them concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. If you remember, when Paul stood before this council, and when he was brought before this council, you remember, yes, he does mention this resurrection, but if you'll also remember, this was common for the Pharisees and the Sadducees to dispute over. It was common for them to have the very same reaction that they had in that moment without Paul's interjection. And so he says, if there's one thing that they could say that was me causing division or causing some sort of issue or riot, it is concerning what I said about the resurrection of the dead, that I am being judged by you this day. So he says, if there's anything, there's one statement that maybe they could use against me, but even then his defense could be that this was an issue prior to Paul's appearing before that council. It was something that they already were fighting over, something that they already had division over. Paul's bringing it up just maybe brought the subject to light once again. So what is Paul's defense against this prosecution by the council? His defense is that each of these things that they said are not true. Said, well, at least are not the full truth. They said that he is a leader of this certain sect of Nazarenes. Well, he is a part of what you might call leadership. He's got a very leadership role within that followers of the way, but he's not the leader of the sect. They say that he brings forth inciting riots or causing there to be mobs or causing dissension. And he says, well, if there's anything that might have caused that, it would have been the one thing concerning the resurrection of the dead. But he even goes back and mentions that in verse 15, that they themselves accept this thing, that even the Pharisees are guilty of this. And so his defense is, I've done nothing wrong, especially concerning the Roman law. And so as he's standing before Felix, and this is what you'll notice, because it's going to get almost to a repetitive sense as he continues to testify. This is what you'll notice about Paul's way of speaking to those in authority here, is he simply addresses them with honor in a very similar way that he addresses in his writings. You know, he sends a greeting, typically gives his own qualifications for writing, and then a sense of thankfulness. And so that's almost what he does in verse 10. He talks about the instead of his own qualifications for writing, he talks about the qualifications for the judgment. You've been a judge of these things for a while. You have been for many years a judge of this nation. And so I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. So he says, judge righteously, in a sense. He's giving the honor where the honor is due, and then he follows that up by defending his own actions, and does so in a way by pointing to the things that they say he's done wrong, and says, obviously, I have not broken any law here. All right, any thoughts, questions, comments? Notice in the, like you mentioned, he brings some stuff up. Notice in this moment, as Paul is testifying for what could be, in his mind, his life, notice three things he mentions. He mentions one thing twice, and then the other in verse 14. He says, according to the way. So he brings up this path, this journey, this way that is mentioned often throughout the recording of his actions, at least. But then he also mentions in verse 15 and in verse 21 the resurrection of life, or the resurrection even of the just and of the unjust. And so even in this moment where he is testifying in a earthly court concerning earthly law, his focus is not only on defending himself because he has done nothing wrong, but he is also focused upon what? Sharing this message of the way, about the resurrection of life. And we'll continue to see that as we keep going here in verse 22 and following. Any more thoughts before we get into verse 22, though? We all going to have to get up and walk around outside, get us awake a little bit more? Come on, y'all. All right, let's keep going. Verse 22 it is. But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned these proceedings and said, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul, that he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. Ooh, Felix, come on, man. You almost have a little bit of a hope for Felix when you begin to read verse 22 and following. But then the further you get within that reading, the further you kind of lose hope for Felix. Notice, even verse 22 is not that delightful towards Felix. When Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the meetings and proceedings and said, when Lysias commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So instead of making a decision at that moment, he kind of puts it off a little bit. Now, he does something that is, in my opinion, very graceful towards Paul in verse 23. He commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for him or to visit him. So he's on house arrest, basically. He's in this position where he has a little bit of freedom in that they can bring him things and they can visit, but Paul, of course, still remains within the custody of the Roman Empire. Now, after some days, when Felix, verse 24, came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul, and notice this, and he heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now, what are the things that Paul taught concerning this faith within the Christ? Well, in verse 25, we see how he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come. Now, notice Felix's response. This is when things kind of take a turn for Felix in a more wrong direction from that hopefulness. Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. I find Felix's response very interesting because I find Felix's response very similar to that of the response of many in the world today when it comes to the following of the way, when it comes to a following of the teachings of Jesus. He heard things concerning righteousness. He heard things concerning self-control. and he heard things concerning the judgment that was to come. And yet Felix's response, or Felix's ultimate decision, was that he will call upon him on a more convenient time. It seems like we get that people of the world, that we get like that at times. When it's more convenient, I'll hear more about these things. When it's more convenient, I'll maybe make a little bit more of an effort. Notice where things really, really go bad here for Felix, though. In verse 26, meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul, that he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. He called upon Paul not necessarily for his desire to learn more about this way. He called upon Paul hoping that one day Paul was going to bribe him to release him. And to me, that's a very sad dissension or moment for Felix there. Notice verse 27. After 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. So instead of releasing Paul after 2 years of this arrangement that was being made, he simply keeps Paul in prison. And I think verse 22 through 27, especially as it pertains to Felix, but even as it pertains to the whole court system that Paul finds himself being in, I think that section is probably some of the saddest parts to me. One, because you see moments where somebody heard the way and could have become a follower, could have done what was right, and instead they're ultimately led, at least in the case of Felix, seemingly they're ultimately led by their desire for money, as well as their desire to please others. You find it coincidental, maybe, the things that Paul taught, or at least the things that we see concerning Paul's teachings in verse 25, very closely resemble some of the issues that Felix had in verses 26 and 27. He was taught concerning righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, and yet he did not practice righteousness, self-control, and seemingly had no care, from what we can see here, of the judgment that was to come his way. Any thoughts on that section?
I think he left him bound for 2 reasons. I think he didn't want him loose for the Jews to kill him.
Yeah.
And I think God still had a purpose for him.
Yeah.
The grip was coming.
Yeah.
So he's got something in mind, because God's plan will always work.
Absolutely. All right, we'll make our way into chapter 25 then.
The thing to look at is he got to teach a lot of guards that kept him.
Yeah.
So they were in there with him.
The worst thing you can do to Paul is to chain him up for 2 years, because all he'll do is just keep writing and keep influencing others. Yeah, that's right. Notice in verse 1 of chapter 25, it's a little bit of a section for us to read, so just buckle in for a minute. Now when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief man of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem, while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore he said, "Let those who have authority among you go down with me, and accuse this man to see if there is any fault in him." When he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. When he had come to the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem, they stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all." But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged before me concerning these things?" So Paul said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For I am an offender. Yes, that's right. I don't know why my brain's slipping up. For if I am an offender, or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But there is nothing in these things which these men accuse me of. No one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar." Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, "You have appealed to Caesar you shall go." Notice some of the just baffling things that happen here. First off, you see the Jews doing a very, very similar thing to what some had even made a pact or a vow concerning in a few chapters earlier, which of course it's now been a few years. So I'm wondering if it's the same group lying in wait, or if they truly kept their vows and didn't live because they never killed Paul. Notice what happens in verse 2. The high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem. Notice this, while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. They had that same desire to have Paul transported on this specific path or this specific way for the purpose of just simply taking matters into their own hands and killing Paul, which in their minds, I guess, would have been the solution. If we kill Paul, we don't have to deal with Paul anymore. And notice what Festus says in verse 4. Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and he himself was going there. And so what happens? Verse 5 says, "Therefore he said, let those who have authority among you go down to Caesarea with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault within him. When he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. The next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought." What happens when Paul is brought? Well, verse 7, "When he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many accusations and complaints against Paul." Notice at the end of verse 7, "which they could not prove." So they're doing the same thing over. They got a new judge in the seat. They're petitioning for this, for Paul to be brought down, in a sense, to them so they could kill him. And when that doesn't work, they bring all these kinds of accusations. And of course, we see in verse 7, none of which they could prove. Now, while we don't necessarily know the specific accusations that are being made, you can probably find a little bit of comfort in knowing that it's probably the same things that he was accused of in verses 1 through 9 of chapter 24, or at least very similar. This causing of strife, this causing of issues, this, that, and the other, even though they're not specifically listed here. While he answered for himself, notice verse 8, "While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all." And so these accusations being made, none of which they can prove, and Paul's response is simply, "I have not broken the law of the Jews. I have not broken the law concerning the temple. I have not broken the law concerning Caesar or the Roman Empire at hand." So notice what happens in verse 9 here. Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, we see that statement once again. It typically doesn't go well for Paul. Wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things?" Notice Paul's very, very good use of words, a very particular use of words here in verse 10. So Paul said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. I don't know why this specific verse is getting me, verse 11 today. "For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appear unto Caesar." Paul basically says, I've already been in their council. I've already stood at their judgment. There's nothing against me deserving of death. And I stand now at the mercy, or at least at the judgment seat of the Roman Empire. And he now appeals even to go before Caesar himself and receive judgment. Notice in verse 11, and it's going to be very hard for me to read for some random reason. Notice his acceptance of whatever judgment is given, though, or at least acceptance of the justice that is to be served or not served. He says, "If I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death," notice what he says about it, "I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things which these men accuse me of, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar." He says, if I've been found wrong, or if I have done anything wrong, I do not object to receiving the punishment for doing something wrong, even the extent of if that punishment is as severe as death. He does not object even to dying if what he has done wrong is deserving of death. However, he understands that what he's done is not deserving of death, nor has he done anything wrong at all. So Festus confers with his council, speaks with his council, and answers Paul and says, "You've appealed unto Caesar. To Caesar you shall go." Any thoughts before we make our way into verse 13 and following?
It's interesting where they were standing, that judgment seat, Caesarea.
Yeah.
It's right on the Mediterranean Sea. And I can just see old Paul going, appeal to Caesar,
Yeah.
and pointing straight west.
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably had a little effect.
Yeah, probably. That's one thing that if you hadn't noticed about Paul, is that while he himself would write, like we're studying in the ladies' class right now, like he himself would write, even in books like 1 Corinthians, that he did not come with these fancy words or with big words or anything like that, or with earthly wisdom. He still knew what he was doing. Paul still knew what he was doing, and still had the ability to make a strong appeal. And so now he's going to be sent up to the Caesar. Any more thoughts before we get into that section? I think we should have time to cover this next section.
Seems like the people that were in charge were afraid to make a decision. They wanted to please the people.
I think the continued use of the phrase wanting to do the Jews a favor is an interesting and unique way of saying that they wanted to maybe keep the peace with the Jews and did not want to have any issues. And so they did what the Jews wanted at times. And while they would not necessarily sentence Paul to death, they would do them a favor and basically sentencing him to death if they had sent him to Jerusalem, where they were waiting to kill him along the way. So yeah, I think they were definitely afraid, at least, of the response of the Jewish people to whatever this might be. All right, let's make our way into the next section here. So let's look at verse 13 and following. Once again, it's a little bit of a longer read. After some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. And they had been there many days. Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face, and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat, and I commanded the man to be brought in. And when the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion, and about certain Jews who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Which, might I say, is a very interesting way of examining Jesus himself, as well as the teachings of the resurrection, verse 19. So I'm just going to note that so that y'all can remind me to talk about that in a second. Verse 20 continues, "And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there to be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. So the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, and Festus commanded Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all the men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, that he himself appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. Therefore I have brought him out before you, especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. Notice some of the things that are written concerning Festus in these following verses. Verse 14 specifically, when they had been many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king and said, "There is a certain man left prisoner by Felix," which I find also very interesting. He's mentioning maybe one who had come before him. Wow, maybe taking some of the pressure off of himself and pointing towards Felix a little bit. But also notice what is mentioned in verse 15. "About whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking him for a judgment against them. So I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accusers meet him face to face and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charges against him." It says it's not for me to send this away or to dismiss this without first hearing the case of Paul, hearing at least the defense of Paul. "Therefore," verse 17, "when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. And when the accuser stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive." Notice this mentioning of what took place in verse 18 and 19 of this court case, if you will. It says, "When I heard these things, there was nothing concerning any kind of Roman law being broken. There was nothing concerning something worthy of death or even worthy of rest under this Roman law. But there seemed to be this division amongst them about their own religion. So it's not a Roman law that he's being charged, or not a Roman law that he seems to be breaking, but it is of this Jewish law or their own beliefs, especially concerning this man Jesus, whom the Jews claim to be dead and whom Paul claims to be alive. In fact, I don't want to use the word claim there because it's not the right word there. Whom Paul affirmed to be alive. So I don't know. I think it's very interesting to see such a large division point, such a thing of strife that has happened be summarized so simply in verse 19. There were some questions against them about their own religion, about a certain Jesus whom they claimed to have died, and Paul affirmed to be alive. And that's a very 10-word summarization of these past 5 chapters of this issue, all concerning this Jesus. In fact, probably concerning all of the turmoil that Paul has faced since his becoming a follower of the way. And so what's the solution here? Well, very similarly to what we saw in the previous solutions, the solution is that we'll hear him out and then we'll make a judgment. So no judgment is currently being made. You keep looking down in verse 20. It kind of gets a little bit repetitive. "I was uncertain of such questions. I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem, there to be judged concerning the matters. Paul appealed and reserved for the decision of Augustus, to be reserved for the decision of Augustus. I commanded him to be kept till I sent him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear this man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. And the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp, they had entered into the auditorium with the commanders, prominent men of the city. At Festus' command, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, all the men who were present here at this moment with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was no longer fit to be alive. And I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, that he himself had appealed to Augustus. I decided to send him. He says, I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. I have no decision certain to write concerning my Lord. Therefore I have brought him out before you, especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges that are against him. Now, here's the interesting part that I find in verse 26 and 27. Once again, he's doing like many had done before him, or like a few had done before him, there's no decision made. There's still not a resolution to this issue concerning Paul. It's just simply a passing off of this moment onto somebody else, and onto this King Agrippa. And then notice what he says in verse 27. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. There are two things maybe that you could take from that. One is that he seemed unreasonable to send it to Agrippa without informing Agrippa what had been wrong. But what I see more of this is it seems to me unreasonable to have somebody in prison of which there is nothing that we have accusation against him. Does this seem similar, at least, to anything else that we've seen within the New Testament, specifically within the Gospels? Does this not remind you of maybe a previous trial that had taken place? A man who was being accused by many of wrongdoing, and yet nothing could be proved as any wrongdoing. And so it keeps happening. Keep getting sent from person to person. Why? Because nobody can prove that they had done wrong. Of course, that other person is the reason why Paul is even in this instance in the first place. It's Jesus Christ the Messiah. You see, as his trial went from one to the next. Why? Because they were bringing up accusations with no proof of any wrongdoing. In fact, many found him to be guiltless, and yet he still suffered the consequences of someone who had done wrong, even though he had done no wrong. And now Paul, for this teaching about this very same man, is appearing before person after person, judge after judge, and now eventually King Agrippa, all because of belief or following after this man who had been unfairly tried himself. And so the result is you get this repetition of appears before a judge, no decision is made, sent to the next. Appears before the next chain in command, no decision is made, sent to the next, ultimately until he appears before King Agrippa. Now, we're not going to get into chapter 26 because we only have 2 minutes, but you'll notice something about 26, and I'd encourage all of us to read it, especially for this week, because this is going to be a very large section on Paul's defense of himself. And I want us to pay attention very closely to each of the things that Paul addresses within his own defense. And I want you to kind of go through and maybe make some notes of some things that stand out this week so that we can be awake enough to bring them up and talk about them next week concerning his own life, the life that was affected by Christ, this Messiah, and then the life that he now lives because of this Messiah. All of that is going to obviously play a pretty big role within his testifying against against the prosecution, the council, and before Augustus. Any thoughts or questions concerning this section before we conclude for the day? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yep. It seems very common to that which had originally appeared within the moment when the commander seized Paul. He was trying to find an accusation, and yet all the accusations were different because nobody truly knew why Paul was even being in prison or taken up in the first place. All right, we'll pick up in chapter 26, verse 1 next week. Thank you.